Hi YouTube, this is EJ Plymouth, formerly known as Problematic Boy. I've been wanting to make this video for a while. The topic of the video is in a particular area that I've studied and am interested in, which is education policy, and it's going to be directed at my fellow netizens of the online left. Um, just a little brief aside, I think it's become pretty clear, increasingly clear, that online is kind of real life now. Like, it's kind of merged into real life. So I think if there's one thing that the online left needs to do, it's one, organize in real life, or, actual outside life. But also have messaging discipline. And I think in some areas, the online left is actually pretty good about that, and that the popular sort of online left Twitch streamers do a pretty good job on messaging discipline on a few different areas. Healthcare, foreign policy is generally pretty good. But there's one particular area where there's a big missing mark, and that's on education policy, which is, of course, is my bugbear and what I'm interested in and what I really like to think about and talk about and what I studied. So I thought I'd make a video that's just sort of like a primer. It's aimed at, I guess, left-wing content creators or people who watch them. I guess if you consider yourself an online left netizen, then yes, this is a video about how to communicate and talk about education policy. So for left education policy, there's two main things. There's one thing that the online left and the left in general, I would say, when they're communicating about this policy, gets right, gets correct. And there's one thing they don't talk about and don't mention, which is the second thing, which they really do need to talk about every time they talk about it, because it is a constant thing that comes up in these streams and on Twitter or, in general discourse. Oh my God, I got a burp. Oh my God. Okay, we move on. That I would like to talk about. Okay, so the first thing is the policy idea that there needs to be only public schools. Okay, this is correct. Okay, and this is very important to mention, that we have a lot of, and not just that there needs to only be public schools, but the reason that there needs to only be public schools is because public schools get money siphoned out of them through vouchers and private schools and charter schools and things like that. So that policy is correct, that public schools have this vulnerability that is not protected, where voucher programs can be set up or other things to get money out of them, which makes the schools less effective. That's correct. And when people talk about public education policy or education policy in general on the left, whether it's like Hassan Piker or Mike from PA, I guess those are like the two biggest ones. But in general, right, when they talk about it, they talk about that correctly. All right, and that's very important to hammer in, because that is a serious issue. But let me move on to the second thing, which is really the core of this video, and that is something that a lot of people don't know. I guess a lot of people maybe don't know about public education as it's actually exists in the United States, is flawed fundamentally. The way that the public education itself is set up. So the way that the public education itself is set up is not that much different as it was set up by Horace Mann. So the Horace Mann model of public school, who is basically the guy who set up public schools in the United States. It's slightly different now, but not really much different. It still operates in mostly the same way. So the way that it was set up is, it was set up in such a way that each community, it was set up as an idea to be marketed to get public schooling in as many communities as possible. Basically, it was saying you have a local property tax, local community tax that's based off of home value that will fund the schools. And then other levels of government won't be very much involved. And that's how they sold the idea during the early 19th century, so that the United States could establish schools. And as far as appealing to people's sensibilities and actually establishing schools, I would give it to that system that it was successful. Schools were able to spread, pop up everywhere, get people into school. Okay, so that is sort of the sole positive legacy of the Horace Mann public school system. It is 2026 now, and there's been some things where there's accommodations, accessibility gaps, funding gaps that's where the state and the federal government can step in and apply funding up to a point so that it meets, whatever criteria that there is. But these public schools are still baseline the Horace Mann model. Now, for people who are on the left, you can see how this, you probably already see systemically how this is an issue. And I just want to say very matter of factly that the public school system of the United States, up to this day and since its establishment, has economic segregation tied into it. Okay? I'll repeat that. Economic segregation is tied into the public schools of the United States. It's not really how public schools work in countries that have national public education or a sort of centralized funding system that has, allotment for each student. And then they also do things like, accommodations and things like that on top of that, right? But in the United States, it still doesn't work like that. You can have, people, home values decided by how good the school is, and then vice versa, it feeds into itself. And especially in the United States, another thing I need to say is if the economic segregation is tied into the school system, since we are the United States, that includes or it implies that there is racial segregation, because the history of the economic history of white people and black people is very different in the United States. So if you're going to economically segregate, you do not have to explicitly racially segregate. So Brown versus Board of Education ended explicit racial segregation. You couldn't do it anymore. But the economic segregation, which is baked into the system, was maintained, okay? Which is why we still pretty much have an element of racial segregation still active. Of course, this still works in like housing too with redlining. So it's like a combo problem where in education it's still operating, and in housing it's still operating. It's still operating in employment even. I guess even more so now. That's accelerated. So that's something we really need to understand, right? That if we want to fix, or we want to have a public education policy as a left wing, okay, we have to say, okay, we need to stop obviously the siphoning of money out of public schools needs to stop. But what also needs to happen is we need to have an actual national centralized funding for education. Because right now you can have wealthy communities with very high home values have public schools that are essentially private schools, even though they are public. Okay, that's just how it is right now. And the public schools are being decided effectively by zip code. Okay, and if you were, this is something I want to say, this is very important. If you were to take all the private schools, all the religious schools, all the charter schools, got rid of them. You just got rid of them. You said, nope, can't do that. We'd still have a serious education problem, and it would still be an extremely vulnerable system. Why? Because you would still have the economic segregation. People would still be economically segregated in their public schools. And then you would get different outcomes in the public schools. And when there's different outcomes in the public schools, some good because they got more money, and some bad because they're getting less money because the home values in the community or the property values in the community are not up to a good enough standard to fund the school properly, then you get different outcomes, and people can exploit that, which is exactly what happened in 1980. 1984 with Reagan. I studied A Nation at Risk 5 years ago. I'm forgetting what year it was, when there was a moral panic over education because of this, well, partially because of this, and right-wing, right-wing loons were able to exploit that and bring us into a system where the money is getting siphoned out. Now the left's position is consistently stop the siphoning of the money. But stopping the siphoning of the money does not fix the issue, because the issue existed before the money started getting siphoned out. So we need to address this problem properly. I thank you for watching. I might make some more videos. I try to do these. They're very under-edited and under-produced. I just try to get what needs out. It's running a little long. But yeah, thanks for watching. All right. Ciao. Ciao. Ciao.